This class will correspond to the fifth essay topic on your list. Uh, that's the one over, it's asking you about what Russia, America offered the world after World War I and about something called fascism. How did fascism lead to World War II? And what this is about is really about ideas. That is, these three things that we're going to discuss: communism from Russia, the 14 points from America, and fascism from Italy and Germany are going to be the major political ideas that have dominated the last 100 years. They were products of the world that followed World War I and the Depression, and they're going to be instrumental in how the world is going to be put together afterwards. And they're going to lead to the Second World War and to the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union after the Second World War, the so-called Cold War. So what I want to do in your class today is go over what all three of these things are and compare them and tie them together. And I want to put them into the context first of the time. Put yourself into 1914. Say you're in one of the major nations of the world, the United States, England, France, Germany, Russia. You were told that you are the high point of civilization. That is, the entire world has been getting better over time. That's a philosophical idea called positivism. It was the dominant philosophy of the late 1800s, early 1900s. That is, the world has been steadily improving, and all the improvements in the world led to you and the civilization around you. So fast forward 4 years. What had the greatest civilization in the history of the world accomplished? Well, it had accomplished this, and 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 this. That is, what you wound up with was a horrible war, a war that killed 19 million people, ended with a giant epidemic that killed 20 million more, right? And so everything that you had been taught, everything that you always believed, all of a sudden looks like a pack of lies. 20 years later, you're going to wind up in a deep depression. Okay, the economics of the world collapses in 1929. That's going to make it even more apparent to you that everything that you've been told is a lie. And that comes to a word. The word is disillusionment. Disillusionment is when you believe that all of a sudden you wake up one morning and you say that everything I've always believed before wasn't true. And if you know any divorced people, you know about disillusionment, as they believed that they were in something and then all of a sudden they weren't. The world after World War I, and even more so after the Depression, is going to be full of disillusioned people. People who believe that what they were always grew up with, the ideas of the world around them, weren't really true. These people were scared, they were angry, and they wanted answers. And they were willing to listen to people who would give them answers, even if those answers would have been traditionally unacceptable in their worlds. Right? And let us look at a specific case: Russia. Russia was one of the major European nations that entered World War I in 1914. Right? In Russia in 1914, there was a political leader. His name is Vladimir Lenin. If World War I had never happened, Vladimir Lenin here would be a sentence in a paragraph in a history book. That is, if you were taking a class on obscure radical political movements of the 20th century, he might get a sentence in there, he might get a footnote. But World War I did happen. When the war started in 1914, Lenin was a socialist. That is, he believed in the principles of an economist named Karl Marx from Germany 40 years earlier. And he was considered to be a fairly radical socialist. He was on the radical wing of socialism. So when the war started, the Russian government said he was a troublemaker, arrested him, and sent him into exile in Switzerland, which, by the way, wasn't a bad place to spend World War I. As Switzerland is a pretty happy place, full of mountains and cows and St. Bernards in their native habitat. So fast forward to 1917. Lenin here is in exile in Switzerland. He is approached by the Germans and asked if he wants to go back to Russia. That is, the Germans figured if he went back to Russia, he could cause trouble and maybe get the Russians out of the war. Lenin said, okay. So the Germans took Lenin and put him into a railroad car. They welded all the windows of the railroad car shut so that nobody could see him as he traveled through German occupied territory. They were afraid that people would catch Lenin cooties. Anyway, Lenin winds up in Russia in 1914. And what he finds is a desperate, disillusioned population. That is, these people entered World War I, they were told by their government that they were going to win. The war went very badly for Russia. That is, Russian armies were destroyed in the field. It was defeat after defeat after defeat. Russia is losing millions of men in combat. As the war drags on, the Russian economy falls apart. Right? They can't import anything because they're shut off from the world by Germany. So there's shortages of everything in Russia. Prices of everything are going up. Like food is in short supply. So in Russia, when Lenin gets there, they have an angry, disillusioned population. In the early part of 1917, this population responded with a revolution. That is, Russia had been ruled by a king called the Tsar, who had absolute power. He was overthrown and replaced by a parliament. This parliament, however, couldn't fix anything. They couldn't get Russia out of the war. They couldn't improve the economy. So you saw these angry, disillusioned people getting angrier and angrier. So when Lenin arrives in the summer of 1917, he finds the people who want answers, and he answers for them. Because the people are asking, why did things turn out so bad? Why are we in this horrible economy? How did we get this horrible war? Lenin has a very easy answer for them. The answer is private property. He said that the root of the entire war was the fact that property was owned by individuals. Why is that a problem? Well, Lenin said that competition, market forces, and just human nature, greed, would inevitably lead to all that property being monopolized. That is, if you've got private property, inevitably you're going to have all that property dominated by a handful of people. Property inevitably leads to monopoly. Right? That was the basic thinking of Karl Marx, the socialist. Lenin believes the same thing. Right? So, those monopolists now own the entire country. However, Lenin says they're not going to be satisfied. That is, greed and market forces are going to make them want more. However, they've now got all the wealth of the country. So what are they going to do? They're going to go to other countries. So property inevitably leads to monopoly. Monopoly inevitably leads to imperialism. But the people who control the wealth still aren't going to be satisfied. Now that they've controlled the wealth of their country, and now that they control the wealth of weaker countries that they conquered, they still want more. But where can they go to find more? They've got to turn on the other monopolists. That is, if property leads to monopoly, monopoly inevitably leads to imperialism, where you had weaker nations being conquered, and then the strong nations will turn on each other, and that gets you to 1917. So Lenin now says he has the cause of the problem. You follow this chart, you understand why Russia is where it is in 1917. So if that's the problem, what's the solution? Well, you get rid of private property. If there's no more property, there's no more monopolies. If there's no more monopolies, there's no more imperialism. If there's no more imperialism, there's no more war. That would have been a very radical thing to say in 1917. Because after all, property is one of the basic foundations of most cultures. It was in Russia. Foundational things in culture have a lot of things that hold them together in a society. It'd be very difficult to get a society to kind of change its basic core beliefs. But these aren't ordinary times. The Russian public of 1917 was desperate. They had this horrible war that was going on. They had an economy that was collapsing. They had chaos and disorder anywhere. They were open to hear things that they never would have listened to before. So Lenin and his followers in November of 1917 overthrew the Russian government, right? And they replaced the old Russian government with a new one, right? That they called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviet Union. It would be the world's first communist nation, right? Communism being a system where property was illegal. That would be part of it. We'll get more into that in a minute. But and Lenin's revolution had a lot of appeal outside of Russia. One place where it had a lot of appeal were in places like Germany, okay, France, Britain. Those nations had been fighting the same war that Russia was. They were reaching similar levels of desperation. Right? They were desperate people there looking for an answer. Lenin had an answer for them. You actually had a attempted communist revolution in Germany in 1919, just after the war ended. It led to a brief civil war in the country where the anti-communist forces won, but it kind of shows you the depth of support for communism around the world. That is, in the developed part of the world, you had a lot of people who were as desperate as the Russian people were. You also have a lot of potential support for communism in the colonized parts of the world. Because remember, Lenin says if you do what he wants, get rid of property, that leads to the end of imperialism. So if your nation was conquered, if you were in Asia, if you were in Latin America, if you were in Africa, communism to you was the solution to your problem. It was how your nation could regain its freedom. Right? So you had a large number of people around the world who saw Lenin's ideas coming out of World War I and saying that's the great hope for the future. You also, however, saw a lot of people all over the world who looked at what Lenin was saying and were totally appalled. Right? At the top of that list is going to be people who own property. Because after all, Lenin says if he wins, he is going to take away your property. If you're lucky, that's all you'll lose. If you're unlucky, he will take away your property and exchange it for a bullet in the head. But the property owners aren't the only people who look at communism as are appalled. Another group of people who would oppose communism were people who believed in the basic kind of human ideas of human rights that came out of the Enlightenment period in the 1700s. Right? That is, if you believe in things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, right? The right to vote for your leaders, right? Those kind of democratic political ideas. If you believe in the rule of law, that is, that the law should be superior over political authority, then the communists to you were terrifying because the communists did not believe in any of that stuff. Let me explain why. The communists said that at the heart, the entire system was controlled by property owners, and that everything else was just a tool by the property owners to keep control. That is, if you saw the newspapers were not telling you the news. The newspapers were just telling you what the property owners wanted you to hear so that they could stay in charge. If you looked at the elections were not free choices. The elections were just carnivals held by the property owners, where they would hold you a fake election in order to keep you distracted while they really ran the country. If you went to the courts, you could not get justice from a court. All the courts would do was what the property owners told them to do. Right? That is actually something that you probably hear all the time. If you go around and hang out with any conspiracy nuts, how many times have you heard the same thing? That those elections don't mean anything, that the courts aren't giving you justice, that the media is fake news, so on and so forth. Right? The communists believed all those conspiracy stuff, and they had a practical reason why they would believe it, because they said that the property owners own all of that stuff, so they're going to use it the way they want. right? And they say, if you're a communist, that the property owners will use all those things in order to defeat your revolution. Right? That is, they're going to use their news media to undermine you. They're going to use their political parties to attack you. Right? They lose their legal system to try to stop you from passing necessary laws. So the communists said that you had to destroy all of that to get the revolution. So the communists had, under Lenin, actually had two major innovations that made communism. One was the socialist economy, an economy without private property. But the second was the political innovation of the one-party state. That is, they said that the only legal political movement would be the Communist Party, because the Communist Party would be the one institution that wouldn't be controlled by the property owners. So the Communist Party could go out and get justice. So if you followed communism, you would get justice, you would get efficiency. And if you didn't believe that, communism was a massive form of tyranny. So you had people who believed in kind of Enlightenment values who would oppose communism. You would have property owners who would oppose communism. And you would have religious people who would oppose communism. Right? The picture you're looking at here is a propaganda poster the communists put out in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. The caption over here in Russian reads, "Religion is the opiate of the masses." That is a quotation from Karl Marx. Marx believed that religion was fake. That is, it was just another one of those tools created by the property owners in order to control the people. So the Soviet Union was hostile to religion. They allowed religions to continue in the Soviet Union, but the official ideology was atheist. That is, they said that the religions were fake, and they said those religions would only allow them to continue if they supported the communist revolution. If they were seen as opponents of the revolution, then they would be stopped. And actually, throughout most of the Soviet Union, religion was seen as basically a backwards regressive force. I once saw a Soviet movie from the 1930s. It was about life in Siberia along the areas controlled by Japan. There, the religious people there were Christian people in the movie. They were called ritualists, and they were presented as backwards, as superstitious, and as traitors, conspiring with foreign enemies to bring down the revolution. Right? So, if you actually believed in a religion, to you, communism was a terrifying satanic force. It was a force out there targeting you, trying to destroy you. And throughout the 20th century, people who were highly religious were very anti-communist, and which led to a lot of things that today would seem kind of strange. That is, in today's world, you probably have heard expressions like radical Islam. Right? The hardest core Muslims in the 20th centuries were allies of the United States because both of them had a common enemy, the Soviet Union, communism. Right? So communism was giving desperate people a answer to their problems. How did we get here after World War I? Where can we go from here? But a lot of people did not like the communist answer. They were looking for an alternative, one way they could move forward, but still not be communist. And that's where the United States comes in. The United States in 1917 was the one nation in the world that was probably the least disillusioned. That is, they had suffered the least from the war. The United States had a certain cachet all over the world. That is, it was seen as the great driver of democracy, the great driver of freedom. And the United States in 1917 had a leader who was widely respected. His name was Woodrow Wilson. Right? Wilson kind of had an interesting story. The typical politician in America comes up through the same channels. That is, usually, if you want to get into politics, your starting point is you wind up working in the legal system in some way. That is, you get a law degree, and oftentimes you start out as a prosecutor. Then you work your way up, to district attorney, to judge, to legislator to Congress, and maybe one day you could work your way up to the top. Wilson, however, didn't do any of that. Wilson's academic background was he was a PhD. He's the only PhD in American history to become president. He had a PhD in political science. And before he got into politics, he taught government at Princeton University. How he got into politics is kind of interesting. In America, in the 10 to 20 years before the First World War, there was a political movement called progressivism. The progressives wanted to clean up the corruption in society, as they wanted to clean up the water, clean up the air. They wanted to fight monopolies, and they wanted to clean up corruption in government. Right? So Wilson was one of those progressives, and he was able to work his way into politics from the academic world because of progressivism. That is, since he didn't have a political background, he sold himself as an outsider. That is, I'm not part of this corrupt political establishment that has created all the problems, so I can be part of the solution. And his background in academics was especially something that let him carry that, because people have stereotypes about college professors. The stereotype is college professors are people who are totally impractical. They don't wear shoes that match. They are spend their time thinking about stuff that is totally abstract, and they have no real appreciation for day-to-day life. Right? This is a stereotype. It isn't necessarily true, but people kind of shape their views of college professors off of it. But there's kind of a flip side of that. If you're somebody who's totally impractical, this also makes you uncorruptible. Because after all, if you don't care about the realities of day-to-day life, then you're not really into money. You're into ideas instead. So you're somebody who would be stubborn enough not to be bought. Wilson parlayed that into politics. In 1909, with no political experience, he was elected governor of New Jersey to try to clean the state up. And in 1912, he got the Democratic Party's nomination for president. He won the election. Right? So he sold himself as this intellectual outsider, somebody who was uncorruptible. Right? And as such, he got himself a lot of support, particularly in Europe. If you were in 1917, the common people of Europe respected him a lot. That is, him and Lenin were probably the two most popular politicians in the world in 1917. And Wilson, as World War I is coming to a close in 1917, has a vision for how he wants to take the world. Right? And it's a vision he laid out in a speech called the 14 Points. If I ask you what America offered the world on your exam, that is, if I give you this essay topic on a test, if you say America offered freedom, you will get points taken off, because freedom was not the only part of the story. True, America had a reputation for freedom. America was a democracy. Wilson was promoting democracy. But England and France were democracies too. That didn't stop them from getting in World War I. Didn't stop America from getting in World War I. What Wilson offered was something more systemic. That is, he offered a way to use democracy in order to fix the problems of the past and prevent war in the future. And those ideas were laid out in the 14 Points address. Right? This was a speech he gave in December of 1917 in order to give America's war aims for the war. That is, what he saw as the terms that he would want in the peace treaty that ended the war. The speech is called the 14 Points because there were 14 specific proposals he asked for. But if you look at those 14 specific proposals, they basically boil down to four broad ideas that are going to shape Wilson's view of the world and really what America's offering the world, right, as a way to get out of the past. Right? Four of them that are stated and one that is kind of implied. And let's take a look at it. As you look at the 14 points, the 14 points was based off of the assumption that the ideals of the Western world were good things. That is, democracy was a good thing. Freedom was a good thing. Freedom of speech was a good thing. Freedom of the press was a good thing. The rule of the courts was a good thing. And that all of those things should continue. But if all of those things were around and you had a war, then what was the problem? Well, the first thing he said was the problem was the worldwide economic system. That is, in the years that built up to World War I, remember you had new imperialism. Under new imperialism, powerful nations were conquering weaker nations and creating autarchies, where the powerful nation would control the markets and resources of the weaker nation, right? And they would isolate them and their colonies from the rest of the world. Wilson said that was one of the root causes of World War I. That if you were a nation like Germany, you did not get a big enough cut of the world, that you would have to go to war in order to get more. So instead, Wilson said the future of the world economy should be based off of free trade, where anybody anywhere in the world could buy anything from anyone else. And to pay for it, they should be able to sell anything anywhere else. Right? So if you're Germany, if you want chemicals for your factory, and the chemicals are only produced in Africa, you could go to Africa and buy them. And in order to pay for them, you could take your chemicals and sell them anywhere. Right? And that if you have a free trade economy, you wouldn't wind up in a situation like World War I. The second major problem, he said, that led a basically good, he said, from his perspective, Western society to war was weaponry, technology. That is, in the generation before World War I, you got increasingly more powerful weapons. We were looked at them in a previous class. And these weapons were limiting the opportunities of nations to stay out of war. That is, say you are France, and you have a dispute with Germany. When the dispute starts, you send your army to the border, and the Germans send their army to the border. This, by the way, is basic human nature. That is, if you get in a conflict with somebody, there are basically four things you could do. You could fight, you could run away, flight, you could submit. That is, if you've ever seen a dog in a fight, sometimes they just roll over on their belly, okay, indicate submission to the other side. Or you could posture. That is, if you've ever been on like a high school, you've probably seen this. Two guys get in a fight, and they just stand there and stare at each other, and nobody does anything. Right? It is both of them are trying to posture, and both of them are looking for a face-saving way out. So let's go back to this conflict between France and Germany. You're France, you have a conflict with Germany. You send your troops to the border. Probably what you want to do is just posture. You want to show strength and find a safe-saving way out while you talk to the Germans, try to come up with a solution. But by 1914, when you go to the German border, you're bringing with you powerful artillery pieces. So are the Germans. Right? So while you're standing there posturing, what would happen if the Germans just started a giant artillery barrage and killed off your entire army? Then you'd be totally screwed. So if you're France, what could you do about that? How about take the first shot? If you think they might start an artillery barrage and kill all your guys, if you start your artillery barrage and kill all their guys first, then they can't do it. The Germans know this, so they're going to be under strong pressure to also take the first shot. And the next thing you know, you have no time to posture anymore. That is, once you start sending men out in the field, it becomes very strong force in order to go ahead and use them. Right? So Wilson said you could eliminate this threat just by limiting the weaponry. That is, if you make the weapons less powerful, if you limit how many weapons a nation could have, then you wouldn't have war in the future. So Wilson said the basic Western values are good values. You could prevent them from fighting in the world by creating a new economic system based off of free trade, by limiting the amount of weaponry, and by ending imperialism. That is, there are all kinds of people in the world who are conquered. These peoples want their freedom. They want to be able to control their own destiny. If a nation like England doesn't give a colony like India, or the nation like the United States doesn't give the Philippines their freedom, then sooner or later they're going to have to fight for it. Right? So the solution to that would be just to give those nations their freedom, end imperialism. Right? So If you're Woodrow Wilson, you have now proposed 3 ways to change the world in order to prevent war in the future without really changing your underlying societies. If you're the United States, England, France, you just create a new economic structure for them where everybody could trade with everybody. You limit the amount of weaponry. You end imperialism. And you do one more thing. You bring those nations together for common self-defense. As Woodrow Wilson believed that World War I was started by Germany, and that Germany started it because Germany was a rogue state. That is, he thought that most nations of the world, even in 1914, were basically peace-loving nations. England, France, Russia were just sitting around minding their own business. They wanted to deal through the traditional rule of law. Germany, he said, was run by a clique of international criminals, by a bunch of generals, militarists who just wanted war. These people, as criminals, had no respect for the law, so they wound up breaking lots of laws. They invaded Belgium, even though it was neutral. They used submarines against American ships. Right? So, if you are one of the peace-loving nations in the world and you see a group of criminals like this, what you need to do is come together for common self-defense. That is, he said that if in 1914, if all the peace-loving nations of the world, England, France, America, Russia, all came together, they would have deterred the German criminals from starting the war in the first place. And even if the German criminals started the war, if the entire world is against them, they would have knocked them out fast and ended the war quickly. So in order to make sure that happened, Wilson wanted an international organization to bring the peace-loving nations of the world together for common self-defense. He called it the League of Nations. Right? And if you put these 4 things together, these are 4 ways that present a worldview that's an alternative to the one that Lenin is proposing. Right? That is, you can keep private property, you can keep democratic systems, you can keep the rule of law, you can keep freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and you could still avoid war anyway by doing these 4 things over here. You will wind up with a new economic international system that will not fight anymore. And by putting these 4 things together, Wilson has also put forward a 5th idea that he didn't state. And that is that anybody who says anything different is bad. Right? That is, radical movements who look at the world differently than the Western nations, who don't support freedom of speech, private property, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, international law, that those are the next rogues who will start the next war. Right? And if that is your belief system, then in 1917, who would be at the top of the list of those potential rogues? How about the communists in the Soviet Union? Because remember, the communists say that all of the basic values of nations like England, France, the United States are fake. That is, they're just the pools of property owners that are put out there to destroy the people, to keep them under control while they inevitably lead to war. Which means if you are the United States, you see the Soviets, those communists, as the next rogue who's going to start the next war. Right? Because they don't believe in the fundamental principles of America. They don't believe in the fundamental limits. And if you're the communists, you think Wilson's proposals are fake. That is, all he's doing is presenting more smoke and mirrors from the forces of the property owners that are inevitably going to start the next war anyway. So what you get out of 1917 is the origins of what would eventually be called the Cold War. Because if you believe in what the communists are saying, then what Woodrow Wilson is saying is a threat. That is, that these guys are inevitably going to come after you. And if you believe in what Woodrow Wilson is saying, then what the communists are saying is a threat. They're inevitably going to come after you. Right? And that conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, between communism and the 14 points, is going to be one of the dominant stories of the world after World War II. But you can already see the starting point of their competition with each other. okay, from World War One. That is, they're both giving competing visions of the future that are mutually exclusive and that are both going out in the world trying to win people over. But in the years before World War II, there was also another alternative that was out there. That alternative came out of Italy. Right? The man you're looking at here is named Benito Mussolini. Mussolini, during World War I, was the prime minister of Italy. And after the war, there was a communist socialist movement in Italy, right, where socialists were threatening to take power. So Mussolini organized around him a group called the Black Shirts. They were a paramilitary force. This paramilitary force overthrew the government of Italy and took power. Mussolini called the group around him that controlled Italy afterwards the Fascist Party. And fascism as a political economic system is going to be the third major message sent to the desperate people after World War I over how they could fix the future. Mussolini initiated fascism, but probably the most famous fascist in the world was Adolf Hitler. He's going to come to power in Germany in 1933. Right? So now we have three competing visions of the world. Okay, the 14 points, communism and fascism. Fascism is difficult to kind of summarize, a lot harder than it is, and it's kind of coarse concepts to the other two. That is usually when the fascists sold themselves. They sold themselves through a negative. That is, Mussolini said he was coming to power to stop the communists. Hitler said the same thing in Germany. Both of them talked of democracy as something that was bad and weak, but they didn't really do much to articulate what they actually stood for. And so, what I want to do here is explain fascism by doing it on their own terms, by comparing them to the other two, right? So that we can understand what they were and show how the coming to power of people like Mussolini and Hitler is going to be a strong force to lead to the Second World War. Right? So here we have the three major political ideas, the 14 points, the communism, and fascism. And we have some representative nations that you could see going into those systems. The 14 points is going to be the basic ideas that you're going to see in nations like the United States, the United Kingdom, France, right? The Western democracies, if you watch the news today. Communism is going to be coming first in the Soviet Union, the USSR, in 1917. You'll see more communist nations, but most of them aren't going to emerge until after the Second World War. And fascism, as I said, is going to start in Italy. The most famous fascist nation, though, is going to be Germany. Right? So if you're looking at Germany in the 30s, you're looking at fascism. And let's start with the money. Because as the great historian John Shaft once said, even when it's not about the money, it's about the money. And they say that Shaft's a bad mother. Right? This is true. So let's look at money. And let's start by looking at what property is going to be. If you are in one of those 14 points nations, you believe that property in general should be private. There would be exceptions. For example, the United States schools were always public. They were owned by the states or by local school district. In England, after World War II, they're going to make health care public. That is, they're going to nationalize health insurance, so on and so forth. So you can have some publicly owned things, but in general, property is going to be owned privately. That is, private economic interests are going to plan out how the economy is going to work. Under communism, it is the other way around. Communism, remember, believes that private property is the root of all evil, so they don't want it. You will still have a little bit of private property in communist societies, though. That is, on the margins, you will see some privately owned things. However, all the important stuff would be owned by publicly. Right? How it would be owned was depended on various types of socialist systems. That is, if you were an anarchist, you thought that if you had a factory, that the workers in the factory should own the factory. Right? If you were a Leninist, though, somebody followed Lenin in the Soviet Union, you believed that the national government of the Soviet Union should own the factory. Right? That if you had that kind of central authority, you would have a more efficient economic system. That is, you would have the efficiency of American corporations, of American monopolies, just without the inefficiency of profit. Right? And that's what the Soviets and communists sold the world. That is, they said, we will make a more efficient system and we will make a system with more justice. They couldn't deliver on either one, but we'll get more on that in a minute. If you're a fascist, you're primarily going to believe in private property. That is, you're going to want the property held by the private owners. And there will be exceptions to this. For example, in Germany, they're going to put all of the radio stations, for example, under state control. The German government is going to nationalize airplane factories. But by and large, all of the most of the economic interests are going to be in private hands. And fascist movements throughout Europe were heavily supported by property owners. And they looked at fascism as the alternative to communism. That is, especially if you were a rich guy in Europe, you thought that democracy inevitably led to communism. This was something that was not true, but a typical rich person probably believed it. Right? So we have the 14 points: communism, fascism having different ideas of the role of property in society. They also had different ideas over how the total economy should work. Right? The 14 points, remember, their big innovation, their big change from the past was that they wanted the world economy based off of free trade, where anybody could sell anything anywhere. Okay? The 14 points was a blueprint for a globalist system. That is, you hear about globalism today, that's what the 14 points was. Communism in the Soviet Union and fascism, though, were both autarkic systems. That is, both of them were closed systems. The Soviet Union believed in was under the principle of was under leadership of Joseph Stalin, said that they wanted socialism in one country. I'll explain that more of that in a minute. So the Soviet Union was a closed system. That is, you had a bunch of resources that were there. The Soviet government took those resources and then sent them into factories. The stuff that was made in those factories were kept in the Soviet Union. They traded very little with other nations. Italy and Germany were the same way. That is, they would control resources and they would keep them in house. Italy and Germany differed from the Soviet Union, though, in that since the Soviet Union was huge, they had plenty of resources within the country. Almost everything they needed was already there. Italy and Germany, however, who didn't. So how they planned on getting resources was by going out and conquering them. They would harvest the resources of other places and okay, keep them in house, send them to their factories, and keep the products in the closed economic system. Basically, if you look at the imperialist economies that were being created under new imperialism, Italy and Germany were designed to work the same way. Okay, so we've got differing economic systems, right, with differing priorities. Okay, the 14 points is going to be a globalized system for free trade with private property. Fascism is going to be basically an imperialist economy. It's going to be an autarky with resources conquered and kept in a closed system, and private and other competition kept out. And communism is going to be an autarkic socialist system where there is not going to be private property. All the resources and products are going to be kept within a closed economic system. Now let's look at over how the society is going to work, how the political society. Now let's start by looking at what the basic unit of society is. In a country like the United States, the basis of society is the individual. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator certain inalienable rights, rights that cannot be taken away from them. So if you're a country like the United States, England, France, the individual is supposed to be important. The individual has rights, right? And you get a society by putting together individuals. If you're a communist or a fascist, you didn't look at it this way. If you're a communist, the starting point that you come up with in society is economic class. Right? That is, they divided society into relationship to property. Right? Said that regardless of kind of individual beliefs, all property owners had common interests. Right? And all people who worked for property owners had common interests. Right? So there was an economic class of property owners, an economic class of workers. What they would, communist rhetoric was this proletariat. Right? And so society was a struggle of class against class, not of individual against individual. If you're a fascist, you believe that the basic unit of society was race. Right? That is, they believed they were inheriting the beliefs of social Darwinism. That is, you had the world, if you looked at the world, you could divide it into an English race, a German race, an Italian race, a Jewish race, a black race. Right? And that these races were in a Darwinian struggle for survival against each other. Right? And regardless of who you were as an individual, what you believed, what really defined who you were was what race you were. Okay? So actually, by the way, if you're looking at this so far, the fascists really haven't come up with anything new yet. That is, if you looked at the world of new imperialism, you can see all of these basic ideas. That is, that they were, the America of new imperialism was a racist society. That is the same ideas of social Darwinism you saw in the United States in 1910, you saw in Nazi Germany in 1935. Autarky. That is the idea of a closed economic system where the weaker races are conquered and their resources are used to benefit the stronger race. Something you saw around all over the world in 1900s. That private property be rerunning this, also something you saw all over the world. What differed under fascism, and also differed under communism, was how they put this together. That is, how do you organize a society under this? In the United States, in Britain, in France, you organize a society through constitutional means. That is, the basic social principle is the idea of a social contract. That is, individuals give up some of their freedom to a political society in order to gain protections. And then what they give up and what they keep is essentially a contract. It is laid out in constitutions, so on and so forth. The communists and the fascists didn't look at it that way, though. They looked at their societies as essentially organisms, right? And that individuals were part of those organisms. And let's explain how that goes. In order to explain it, while you're listening to this, stick out your right hand in front of you. And once you've stuck your right hand out in front of you, stick up your thumb. So you should be looking at the screen. You should have a fist pointing towards the screen and a thumb pointing straight up. Right? Now look at your thumb and say out loud, what are the constitutional rights of your thumb? Right? You can put your hand down now. That is, say your thumb decides he doesn't like the decisions that your brain is making. Can your thumb demand that an election be held in order to come up with better decisions? Right? Say your thumb decides he doesn't want to be your thumb anymore. He wants to be Angelina Jolie's thumb. Can your thumb quit, disassemble himself from the body, and then go over and be a thumb on a better body? Right? The answer to that is no, because your thumb in and of itself doesn't have any meaning. Your thumb only has meaning as a part of the body. Right? As long as it serves the uses of the body, then it's important. But if your thumb isn't serving a purpose for your body, then it's a problem. And if you're communist or fascist, that is the analogy that explains to you how their societies work. Because remember, the communists believed that societies were a composition of economic classes. The communists believed that they were the representatives of the working class, that they would bring the working class to power against the opposition of the property owners, and that property owners all over the world would try to stop them. So if you were an individual in the Soviet Union, you as an individual were important, as long as you served the interest of the working class. If you didn't serve the interest of the working class, then you were a problem. In Nazi Germany, you as an individual were important, as long as you served the interests of the German race. If you didn't serve the interests of the German race, then you were a problem. Why were you a problem? Well, think about it in terms of your body. Your body is the collection of millions of cells, all working together in harmony. That is what makes you you. But there can be cells in your body that aren't working in harmony with others. That is, they just exist in your body and do their own thing. They split off, grow, and multiply. They consume resources and don't provide anything for the rest of the body. What do you call a group of cells that is just growing within the body, consuming resources, and not providing any use for the rest of the body? We call them cancer. That's basically what cancer is. A bunch of cells that have mutated, they're just working for themselves and they're expanding rapidly throughout the body. Why can't you just leave them alone and let them do their own thing? Because if you do, they will eventually kill the body. That's what dying of cancer is. That is, those cancerous cells have taken over so much that your body doesn't work anymore. Right? So, what do you need to do in order for that not to happen? Well, you got to find those cancerous cells and you got to kill them first, right? Which is exactly the logic of a communist or a fascist society. Right? That is, the communists believed that property owners in outside of the Soviet Union, okay, in England, France, Germany, would always be trying to destroy the revolution in the Soviet Union. Right? Because after all, right, it's the threat of a good example if nothing else. So they're bound to be looking for weak links, individuals in the Soviet Union who would be willing to sell out the working class. Also, they figured that some of the property owners escaped. They're in hiding in the Soviet Union. They're just waiting for the right moment to come out and retake power again. Okay? That their society was full of little cancers like that, little individuals who are conspiring against the work of the class, which means they're going to be very aggressive in going out there to find these cancers and wipe them out. Right? And the Soviet Union's mentality is the idea that there were all kinds of threats out there to communism and that they were working with weak links within the society is going to make the Soviet Union a very paranoid place. And if you look at the Soviet Union in action, it was really a monstrous tyranny that especially reached this high point during the 1930s. The ruler of the Soviet Union, a guy named Joseph Stalin, was totally paranoid. He thought the Soviet Union was full of enemies, enemies of the working class who were infiltrating through society. So he created a secret police to go out and find those enemies. He gave every member of the secret police a quota of how many enemies of the state they were supposed to find. If you didn't meet your quota, you were obviously one of the enemies of the state. So everybody who was in the secret police met their quota. Right? If you couldn't find any enemies, you would just make some up. In this Ukraine alone, the communists killed 10 million people in the 1930s, either through rounding them up, sending them into prisons, shooting them on the spot, or through mismanagement of farms, creating starvation that wind up killing them. It's also the major idea behind fascism. That is, you're in a country like Nazi Germany. You believe that Nazi Germany is the country of the German race. But there are plenty of little cancers floating around. Right? For example, you have Jews, members of different races that were within the body of Germany. They are expanding. They are taking resources. They are growing. Okay? They are little cancers that will kill the German race. You have political opponents of the Nazi Party. These are also cancers. They're getting support from foreigners. They are self-interest people within Germany who have their own personal interests at the top, not the interests of the race. So the Germans are going to create a police state, a secret police that's going to be out there looking for those types of cancers and are going to be willing to destroy them. Okay? So we have a political society in communism and in fascism which says the individual isn't the basis of society and that the society as a whole is an organism. If you're not working for the benefit of the organism, then you are a cancer that needs to be destroyed, right? And these societies are going to differ over how leadership of the society is going to work. In a country like the United States, Britain, France, you have a system that where leadership is very limited. Right? For example, President Trump is going around saying how he's going to reopen the economy. He only has a limited authority to do that, right? Because say he says the entire country should reopen on May the 1st. IBM is privately owned. So if IBM says screw that, we're staying closed, then IBM is going to be closed, right? You have states. If the state of California says screw that, California is closed, there isn't much that Trump could do to force them to open. That is, the entire United States is based off of this kind of thing. That is, if you have the basic unit of society as individuals, that individuals give up power in constitutional limits, then the power of any element within the government in order to do anything is always going to be limited too. Right? And the way the constitutional systems work in countries like England, France, America, is that no particular individual, even within the government, has the authority to use all of the power of the government. Right? Under communism, you see kind of a different story. That is, the government, the leadership at the top controls all the levers of society. You don't have independent courts. You don't have independent businesses. You don't have independent churches. But the principle of communism was that the entire party should run the country, not any one person. There are exceptions to this, like you saw this during the Soviet Union under Stalin's time. You saw this in China under Mao's time. But generally, a communist society is going to have a collective leadership. That is, the entire party comes together to make decisions, with the executive authority being held in something called the Politburo. In the Soviet Union, the Politburo were the 12 top executives of the Soviet Union. And they were supposed to come together collectively to make decisions. That is, no one member of the Politburo was any more important than any other member. Right? In a fascist society, though, they believed very strongly that one person should be in charge. In Germany, they called this the Führer principle. Führer was the German word for leader. Right? They saw this as basically to the way an organic society should work. That is, let's take the analogy of a body. If all of Germany is one body, one German race, then it stands to reason that the body should have a brain, and that this brain should have the sole authority to make decisions. In the Soviet Union, an organic society, the brain was a collective brain. That is, a handful of individuals came by and collectively made decisions. If you want an analogy for it, if you've ever seen the old Star Trek TV show, The Borg, that is, the Borg did not have one leader, they had a collective, a group, a entire hive that came together to make decisions. The fascists, though, they had one leader, Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, okay, who would have final authority to make any decision. He snapped his finger, something got done. Right? And the final thing I want to compare these societies about is what these societies are going to think of war, because that brings us into the Second World War, the next topic. If you're a country like the United States, France, Britain, you fight wars all the time, right? You start wars all the time. That is, you go by and you can see a war as a way to gain what you want. But even if you do, you look at war as a necessary evil. That is, you say that war is a bad thing, but we have to fight it in order to get what we want. Okay? The Soviet Union saw war exactly the same way. And this is something that would be surprising to somebody who grew up in the United States. Because in the United States, you hear basically propaganda stories about the communists, about how the communists were always looking to expand, who were always on a program of world conquest. In the Soviet, if you grew up in the Soviet Union, you would find the statement about the United States just as surprising, because you would have grown up under propaganda that said the American capitalists were looking to conquer the world, that these were warmongers, everything they did inevitably led to war. But the Soviet Union and communist societies in general were very reluctant to go to war. Right? Why they were reluctant to go to war came out of their ideological system. Because you have to remember, if you're dealing with communists, the communists actually believed in communism. Right? This is a very difficult thing to understand today because looking back in 2020, we know that communism was a total failure. It promised efficiency, it promised justice, it couldn't deliver either one of them. But the communists of 1917, of 1938, even of 1970, were true believers. That is, they thought that their system was going to win. Their system was working, right? That is, they looked at countries like the Soviet Union, they saw countries that were primitive who all of a sudden have steel mills that are producing enough weaponry to win World War II, so on and so forth. That could put a man in space, that could put a satellite in orbit. So if you are a true believing communist, you would think of war as a bad thing and unnecessary. Okay? You would look at it the same way the United States would. You would start wars every now and then as a way to get what you wanted, but you would look at that as a necessary evil. You would not look at war as something that you would want. Okay? Why not? Well, let's look at what the communist and socialist ideas say about the future. They say, for one thing, that the development of society has gone hand in hand with the relationship of people to property. That is, they said the big advance of countries like England, France, the United States in the 17 and 1800s was what they called the liberation of the bourgeois and the small farmer. That is, the people of the towns and the small farmers were able to get control of their own lives. That made them politically powerful and that made them economically powerful. Without them being controlled by aristocrats anymore, by the big landowners, they could go out there and make money. If you had a country like Russia, which was controlled by the big landowners, then that meant that you were falling farther and farther behind countries like the United States, England, Germany, that let the small landowners, the small property owners do what they wanted, right? If, on the other hand, you tried to get the economics and technology that countries like the United States and Germany were making, that you would have to change your political system. That Russia under the Tsar would have to give small landowners, uh, these people of the towns, more power. Right? That is, that you couldn't keep an aristocracy and have the 18th and 19th century economy going at the same time. That you had to have one or the other, that either you would wind up falling so far behind that you get weak, or you would have a revolution where you would have to loosen things up enough that the small property owners, the small landowners would take over. They expected the same thing from communism. That is, the communists thought that they were liberating the working people. That's the people who worked in the factories. They thought that this would lead to a huge explosion of efficiency. That every year, communist Soviet Union would produce more and more stuff, would produce more and more wealth. It would produce more and more technology. That although it started out behind because it inherited this aristocratic government from the czars, that they would catch up with the United States, England, France, and then zoom past them. Once they zoomed past them, then America, England, and France would be in the same position that the czars were in. Either they would change their political systems a little bit to try to catch up with the Soviet advances, in which case you would have revolutions in America, England, France when the working people took over, or they would fall farther and farther behind the Soviet Union. So every year you waited, the war that where you would destroy the United States, England, France would get easier. And so time is on your side. You just wait. In the meantime, remember, let me go back a slide here. Remember, you thought of what the logic those nations that had private property worked under. That private property inevitably led to monopoly. That monopoly inevitably led to imperialism. That imperialism inevitably led to war. So if you keep that in mind, then that means these nations that have private property, the United States, England, France, Italy, Germany, are inevitably going to go to war with each other. So if you're a communist nation, if you could just figure out how to stay on the sidelines, okay, project enough power that the property owning nations don't attack you, then they'll turn on each other and fight amongst themselves. And if you keep that in mind, it makes really what the Soviet Union is going to do during the 20th century make a lot more sense. Because there are a lot of things about the Soviet Union which are hard to understand. For example, if the Soviet Union wanted worldwide revolution and they were a nation that wanted war, then why didn't they ever start it? That is, you go from 1945 to 1990, the Soviets made no attempt to conquer the world that the Americans didn't make. Right? Also, if you look at the Soviets before World War II, in 1939, they made a peace treaty with Nazi Germany. It was called the Non-Aggression Pact, where they said that they would not attack the Nazis if the Nazis wouldn't attack them. And part of that deal was they let the Nazis invade Poland, and basically communist Soviet Union split the country with them. Why would the communists do something like that? Because of how they looked at how the property owning nations of the world were going to act, according to communist thinking. That is, they figured in 1939, if we cut a deal with the Nazis, that the Nazis will just go to war against England and France, that they will spend the next few years fighting each other, and that will weaken them all. That will speed up the inevitable revolution in all of those nations, and leave the property owners who still control those nations so weak that if we decide we want to fight them later on, okay, we'll win. We'll win a lot easier. Why not start a war with the United States in 1945? Because you figure every year you wait, you're going to get more powerful. The Americans are just going to get weaker. Okay? In 50, 100, 200 years, you figure you'll be extremely efficient and they will be farther and farther behind you. And they might try to liberalize in a desperate attempt to catch up with you, in which case they will get a revolution. And even if they don't, they will get so weak and insignificant that in 100 years, 200 years, you could just walk into America and take the whole thing over. Right? If time is on your side, you're in no hurry to go to war. War is a bad thing. The Americans, by the way, in 1945 looked at the communists exactly the same way. They had the added advantage of actually being right. Time was on America's side. Every year, America got more effective, the Soviets got weaker. In the 1980s, in a desperate attempt to liberalize to catch up with the Americans, the Soviets generated a revolution. Communist government got overthrown, and today Russia wound up following along the footsteps of what America and England were doing. Okay? So if you look at the 14 points people, America, England, France, you look at the communists, they all thought that a big war was bad. They didn't want to fight one. The fascists, on the other hand, thought that war was a good thing. Actually, they thought that war was the point. Okay? War was the one thing that tied all of their beliefs together. Okay? And let's go into why. That is, if you are the leader of Italy, if you are the leader of the Soviet Union, and if you go to war, what's going to happen? Well, for one thing, during the war, the weak people are going to die. That is, the old, the sick. And that is a good thing. Because remember, you think that your nation is an organism that is the collective will of your race. You have an Italian race, a German race. If the weaker people in Germany and Italy are dying, That means the race as a whole is getting stronger. Okay, you're sacrificing the weak cells for the benefit of the entire organism. Right? So war is like exercise for your nation. It's making the entire nation stronger. Okay? If you go to war, you wind up conquering more resources for your nation. Okay? You make a better autarky. You can in turn use those resources to put into your factories, and your conquered areas are now markets for what the factories produce. Right? The conquered areas are now places for the race to expand. You could send Germans into Eastern Europe and they can settle there, making a bigger, stronger Germany. Right? So war serves all of your purposes. And also, you would see an attempt to avoid war as silly. Because remember, you thought that race was the basic unit of society, that the races of the world were in a Darwinian struggle for survival against each other. There was a German race, a Jewish race, an English race, and that if they're in a Darwinian struggle for survival against each other, they're going to be in conflict with each other. Right? So if you don't attack them, they're going to attack you. And if you are the stronger race, then in a Darwinian struggle for survival, you will emerge victorious. Right? So war was something they saw as good, as positive, as inevitable, and as necessary. It would make their race stronger. And actually, if you look into what they did during the war, there's the whole ideas of the Holocaust, the genocides they ran. You saw earlier that I showed you a movie of the concentration camps. You could understand from you look at this why they did this. That is, those members of the other races that were within Germany were cancers, so they needed to be destroyed. Those peoples of other races who came from outside of Germany, from the conquered places, well, those are just weaker races. If they don't serve the will of the strong race, then we can do whatever we want with them. Basically, it's just social Darwinism without any compassion whatsoever. It is the logical extension of what you saw under imperialism, right? So, if you're a fascist, war isn't just good, war is the point. And if you play video games, if you've ever played a game like Hearts of Iron or Europa Universalis, one of those strategy games, basically a fascist looked at their nations the same way that you would look at one of them if you're playing that game. There's the whole point of the game is to fight wars with each other and to conquer, and everything that goes in with those nations is just there to strengthen the war effort. And you can see kind of how all these fascist principles will wind up coming together for the idea that these nations needed to go to war. So, if the last part of that essay topic I asked you is what role did fascism lead to the development of World War II? Well, these fascist nations, Italy, Germany, Japan, are going to start World War II. And they're going to start it because that's what their entire kind of logic says they should do. Is they should go to war and they should go in, which is why fascism winds up being just completely discredited after the Second World War, because these were ideologies whose only point was to go to war and kill people. They committed all kinds of atrocities, such as the Holocaust, in following this plan. And they didn't even win the war. That is, the fascist nations wound up being destroyed by the democratic nations and by the communists. Which is why 70 years later, it's kind of funny that fascism is making a comeback around the world. That is, if you look into many nations in the world, you see a lot of peoples talking according to fascist ideas. That is, that the global economy is bad. You're hearing all kinds of racist bullshit. Okay, you're hearing, especially the idea of the Führer principle coming back, that you should give a leader all kinds of power. Right? And that they're inevitably leading in the same directions. As fascism was down for 70 years, largely because of the Second World War, and now that our collective memory of the Second World War is going away, fascism is starting to look more appealing again. And actually, it's also a frightening vision of things to come if you look at communism. Today, communism has been completely discredited because of how badly those communist nations work. If you around the world today, you can still see lots of people who remember living under communism, and very rarely do they remember it as a particularly good thing. In 40, 50 years, communism is just going to be something in a textbook. Okay? People will read about it. They will not have any kind of emotional experience of actually being part of it. And so you probably will see, if you can see a revival of fascism, you can see a revival of communism too. Probably in a generation or so, you might even see some nostalgia about it. Anyway, so these are the conflicting visions of the world, and we're going to talk more about them as we go through the rest of your class. Particularly, we're going to relook at the 14 points again after we look at the Second World War. But the next thing I want to go into is, if the fascists are going to start the Second World War, why are they going to lose it? And we will deal with that in your next topic.